respect earned? I told her that. Because respect is not earned, respect is given because we all have an inherent human dignity.
Just a bit of a backstory about me. I have, for the last 3 years, taken a bit of a deep dive into masculinity in the contemporary South African scene. So that means that I have to consider this huge crisis of gender-based violence. But like Luke says, the conversation around men as a participant in that conversation is obviously often an accusatory one, not one that reflects and includes them into the solution. So what I have for you here today might come across as a little bit grim, and it is actually quite sad, the statistics that I have. But this is the reality that we're facing. And some of these statistics are from research that was done in the early 2000s, and then some of them are more research statistics that come up further today. So if any of you want that research, come my way, I've got all the links. I've just come out of university, I know how to reference. Okay, so what the crisis of men's mental health has a very sad and confronting reality. The reality is that we ranked South Africa as a country 10th out of 190 countries in the world for suicide rates, for the high suicide rates. And furthermore than that, men are 4 to 5 times more likely to commit suicide and die by suicide, whereas women are more likely to try to perform the acts. They don't generally die from the act of suicide. And the thing that we need to remember is that those numbers are statistics, but there's a lot of stories, there's families, there's people, individuals, partners that are actually left with these kind of high, very, very, very scary rates. And behind the statistics is a crisis that we actually don't talk about enough. Facing the many crises that we have in our world, men's mental health is definitely sidelined or not prioritized. And it's costing lives, it's tearing apart families and communities, as we increase our recognition of mental health, we need to actually consider and recognize that we often overlook the well-being of young boys in particular, but men also. So that's why we're here today, because in our country, men, and this is generally, and I also just want to go back a bit, I'm speaking to everybody in this room, women, men, LGBTQ, non-conforming, everyone. This is important for us, even if we don't want to consider these kind of things. It's important for us to find a solution to go forward. So men in our country are often growing up under very rigid gender norms. And those gender norms are defining our masculinity with silent battles of individual conflict. There's often isolation or ostracization for things that young men or boys come forward for, even older men. There's a lot of loneliness that are facing a lot of our men in our country because of these gender norms. And my master's in academia and a lot of academia links this mental health crisis in men directly to the crisis in masculinity, which is a global crisis that we're currently figuring out in academia. So to consider for South Africa, suicide is the 4th leading cause of death for young people between the age of 15 and 24. So it's really up there, and that's in the hands of our own young people being so lost and so lonely and so isolated that they cannot actually physically ask for help or reach out to somebody for help. And an even more staggering statistic is, of all the suicides that are recorded in South Africa, 79% of those are actually men and young boys. So it's almost an 80-20 ratio of how many people are dying by suicide in our country. And that's actually a very recent research study that's been released. So my master's went into a deep dive of what underpins this crisis. And I was going to pose this to the room, but just to speed things up. Everything, we can simply put it under this huge banner of stigma. But that didn't sit well. It was an easy answer. I think it's a bit more complicated than just saying stigma. I think there is stigma exists in a complex web of historical, cultural, and many other kind of beliefs and values that we have that create our idea of what it means to be a man. So when we look at South Africa's context, we need to consider our historical context of and the cultural forces and societal forces that are molding the ideas of masculinities across races and cultures and genders, etc. So, like Dee said, and I'm very glad she prefaced the identity question, identity is not a static concept. It's very fluid. It moves, it shifts. I'm still figuring it out. It's not something that you wake up and just say, oh yeah, today I'm one hell of a man. So we see in the research that it shifts from race, culture, ethnicity, even country. We have different ideas that kind of define what our ideas of the identity of masculinity is. And for a long time in South Africa, the government and the state had a very, very direct influence into what kind of confined or defined masculinity. So we have, what we shape as male and female identities as well. So from my opinion, and this is, I'm being careful here, we have to consider our histories of colonialism, slavery and apartheid, and these systemic oppressive forces that drive our ideas of manhood across cultures. And even though we are 30 plus years into a democratic South Africa, we now are seeing the effects of what institutionalized violence and domination is doing to our young men, because they don't actually have resources and tools to grapple with these rigid binaries of what masculinity means to them. And furthermore, we see that a lot of African feminist literature directs this notion and connection of violence to our masculinity is directly linked to our crisis in GBV. So it frustrates me a lot as an activist when people are talking about GBV and we forget that whole population of men and masculinity in the conversation. We can't keep pointing fingers at a whole part of the conversation. It's not going to get us anywhere. And we know that because of our past being drenched in violence and domination, manhood in South Africa has become very synonymous with stoic, invulnerability, dominant positions within the family structure, and then silence, isolation, huge one. And we also know with men and women who suppress emotions, they can experience mental health deterioration, which often results and manifests in destructive behaviors. Whether that affects others or the individual, it can result in things like addiction, violence, emotional outbursts. And these behaviors, we know categorically, are not just affecting men. They're affecting all of us, our families, our communities, our children. And so I've got a little piece from a Sive Ngezi. He's an actor and an activist. He says, the problem in society is not masculinity or men, actually. It's rather the concept of toxic masculinity. And we actually need to interrogate what this toxic masculinity is, because I think it's a bit of a throw word that we can use around as a tool to justify opinions about gender-based violence or etc. And we need to recognize that this concept of the strong, silent type is not just damaging, it's actually detrimental to our young men, because it drives them to internalize their struggles until suicide feels like the only kind of out to what they are burdened with. So just to wrap up a little bit, coming up to 16 Days of Activism, as Luke says, it is centered around gender-based violence. It's a very important time to recognize the violence and the kind of issues that we have within society. But what is being done is that we are forgetting the young boy child and men in that conversation. And when it comes to gender-based violence, we need to be more comprehensive. Because yes, perpetrators are often seen as men, and yes, men are the most common they commit the most acts of violence, but that's only a fraction of the story, because an alarming statistic is that between 2 and 5 boys in South Africa experience sexual abuse before they are 18, and 20% of those acts take place in the school setting. And even more interestingly, which you don't often think, is children that have experienced sexual abuse before the age of 18. Young boys are actually 3% higher in the rates of sexual abuse in comparison to girls. So we would think stereotypically that girls are being the most targeted, but we're missing a huge gap in the conversation. So we need to actually consider that our young men are being socialized by families, schools, churches, peers, politicians, into thinking that vulnerability is a weakness. And that is detrimental, because telling a young man to man up and endure hardship without complaint, over time the emotional suppression isolates them and leaves them completely alone, which is not fair, first of all, to our young people, but it's also just not good enough in terms of the ending of violence in our country. And we need to consider young boys. It's not just a female issue, violence. We also need to consider the pressures of being a man and our rigid ideas of masculinity, and how our economic climate, our unemployment rates, and broader issues are actually having an impact on the pressures of what we think manhood means. So this is one of my things that I actually was in a training this week, but someone spoke up and said that, sometimes it's really stressful as a man, because you can try and dismantle a lot of the rigid norms and understandings of what you've been told what a man is, and then you get confronted by your partner or something, and they put you straight back into that box that you're trying to break open. So this is where I would like to say to the women and partners and anyone, we need to also do interrogation within ourselves, because we also have rigid norms that are dictating what we expect men to be, and those can also be very detrimental. And then we also need to, a big part of my master's and kind of the concluding statement of my master's is that we seriously need to start rethinking masculinity. If we wanted to address the conversation of gender-based violence, we can't say, we can look at the criminal justice system, we can look at so many systematic areas that need shifting. But if we don't rethink and reteach what it means to be a man and what manhood is to our men in South Africa, we're going to be fighting a losing battle, honestly. We need to start at an education level, in the formative years of our young boys and girls as well. Because we know that rigid and traditional gender norms are not biological, they are learned. So if they can be learned and introduced by our families and communities, we can unlearn and teach something new. So we need to, and we also need to shift our perceptions of what cultural practices and kind of the stuff that initiates you or kind of puts you on your path of manhood. We need to reconceptualize those kind of rites of passages that we experience as young people as opportunities to foster mental health awareness rather than ingrain like rigid gender norms or rigid ideas of masculinity. It's a moment to teach young men that there's strength in community and asking for help, and masculinity is not a thing of isolation. So I'm going to leave you to say that it's not impossible. I do think it's and what we're doing here today, and a lot of what Luke and a lot of organizations are doing, is looking at rethinking, breaking the silence, rethinking masculinity, and finding systematic solutions, which we can create a society where all men, boys, are seen, valued, and supported, regardless of where their thought processes are going. We need to create safe spaces, and we need to hold spaces, especially for our young men, so that they can navigate this masculinity journey and identity journey, because it's all about identity. And when men heal, society has an opportunity to heal. So we need to take consideration of our historical kind of context, and that can help move our society to a better space of less violence, or no violence would be preferable. And we also need to ensure that our young men and everybody are not carrying their struggles alone. So just to leave you, to everybody here, it's complicated when you're getting into the conversation of identity. It's a personal journey. It can be impacted and affected by lots of external stresses. And I think we need to find the strength to carry on with your struggles, but not alone. We need to rely on our community, and we need to reach out to other people and share burdens by reaching out and choosing to thrive in our world. On the other end of that, we also need to listen. We need to listen, we need to believe, we need to support and be proactive for women, men, children, young men, and young girls as well, for us to redefine what it means to be a man is important for not just only our men, but it's for all of us as well. So I'm going to leave you there, and I'm hoping everyone else will give you a bit more of a personal insight into our crisis in suicide. This was meant to give you a very general picture of where and what these issues are coming from and why we're facing them, and kind of like where we stand in the grand scheme of things. But yeah, I'll leave you there. I don't know if there's any questions, but at the end. Okay, cool.